There we go. Thank you all for joining us today for Professor Chris Fraser's talk. Chris Fraser is the Richard Charles and Esther Yupik Lee Chair in Chinese Thought and Culture. His research specialization is in classic Chinese philosophy, particularly how early Chinese theories of mind, knowledge, and language intersect with issues in contemporary epistemology, action theory, and ethics. I'm so thankful he could join us today for his talk, A Daoist Critique of Morality. Professor Fraser, is there anything that you would like to add to your introduction? Oh, I think...
No, I had to unmute myself. No, thanks. That's already too much.
Okay, sounds good. You can go ahead and take it away now.
Okay, welcome everybody. If you're comfortable turning on your video, please go ahead, because it's nice to see people's faces. I put a handout in the chat box. If you can't see it, if it gets pushed out of the way or something, let me know, but I think you can see it right now. And I'm going to use screen sharing to present a PowerPoint. And the content of the handout is exactly the same as the PowerPoint. Okay, so before I go into the screen sharing, a bit of background. In early Daoist texts, we find this, I think, really quite remarkable rejection of what at the time were conventional moral concepts accepted by almost everybody, except for a group of political realists who simply dismissed the whole idea of guiding conduct by what we recognize as moral values. And I've always just thought that this was a very fascinating reaction to what at the time were conventional moral values. And it turns out that this reaction is grounded in a pretty sophisticated technique of the very idea of a norm. And so it's an interesting set of ideas to explore. We may or may not accept them, but I think we benefit from trying to understand them. So what I'll do today is I'll give you a relatively short talk. I hope we'll be done in less than 40 minutes or so. And I won't go into a whole lot of detail in the texts. And I won't try to get really, sophisticated or detailed with analyzing what I think is going on. It's more a question of presenting the ideas and introducing them to everybody and giving you some food for thought. Okay, so I'm going to turn on the screen sharing now. Okay, how does that look? Does that look like a normal PowerPoint presentation now? It does. Okay, good. I asked because I've got like a multi-screen setup, so I'm never sure I'm really showing the right screen. Okay, so our title is A Daoist Critique of Morality. Here we go. So a central question in early Chinese thought is framed this way. What is the way, the path, the course, the Dao by which to guide social and personal life? And most of the texts from the period are concerned with addressing this particular question. So if you think of questions about what is a good life, if you think questions of right and wrong, if you think about questions about how to organize society, they subsume all of those questions under this broader umbrella question of what is the path, what is the way? And a prominent answer in classical Chinese philosophy, which is the Warring States period we're looking at here from roughly the middle of the 5th century BC to fairly late in the 3rd century BC. A very, very prominent answer across the texts of that period is that the way, fundamentally, is a path by which you act according to norms of benevolence and righteousness. So benevolence can also be thought of as a kind of kindness or goodwill. It's sort of a master virtue for human beings governing how we interact with other people. It's a relational virtue. It's primarily concerned with how we treat others. And it's paired with the virtue of, here I'll interpret it as righteousness. You can also think of it as duty. It's a norm, it's a virtue referring to following the norms associated with your social role, basically. And this idea that the path is the path of benevolence and righteousness is endorsed by a whole bunch of different schools of thought at the time, but primarily by the most prominent, the named schools of thought, which would be the people we now refer to as Confucians. They didn't call themselves that. They called themselves literati, and the Daoists. So this is this really widely shared background assumption that the Dao is the path of benevolence and righteousness, and then we're going to talk about different theories giving the content of these virtues. So against that background, consider the implications of an exchange like this from the classical Daoist anthology, Zhuangzi. So in this particular exchange, the very short dialogue, there's one character who's been off studying with the sage king Yao, and he has a conversation with a Daoist recluse named Xu You. And Xu You says to him, so what have you been learning with Yao? And he says, well, Yao taught me that you should devote yourself to benevolence and righteousness while clearly stating or clearly articulating what is right and wrong. So this is very common sense, prevailing advice about self-cultivation, being a good person. Devote yourself to the path of benevolence and righteousness and try to clearly articulate what is right and wrong. And Xu You responds to him by saying, well, then why bother coming to see me? Yao has already tattooed you with benevolence and righteousness and cut off your nose with right and wrong. So how will you wander the aimless and wild, unbound and uninhibited, turning and shifting path? The blind lack the means to appreciate the attractiveness of eyes and facial expressions, and the sightless lack the means to appreciate the look of richly colored embroidery. Now, let me unpack what he's saying a little bit. In traditional classical China, there were a traditional 5 sets of corporal punishments. And the lowest level of these judicial corporal punishments was to tattoo your face to show that you were a convict. So you might have people going around with a big black tattoo across their forehead or something. And the next most severe of the punishments was to amputate your nose. So Xu You says to him, by teaching you to devote yourself to the path of benevolence and righteousness, Yao has done the equivalent of mutilating you in a way that's normally associated with punishment. So he's mutilated you. And given that he's mutilated you in this way, how are you ever going to wander the aimless and wild, unbound and uninhibited turning and shifting path? The implication being that the actual Dao you want to follow is aimless and wild, unbound and uninhibited. It turns and shifts. And since you've been mutilated in this way, you've lost the ability to follow that Dao. And he fills out that metaphor a bit by saying, the blind lack the means to appreciate visual beauty. He just says there's 2 ways here using 2 parallel expressions. So by analogy then, he's saying that common sense morality mutilates us in such a way that it deprives us of the capacities we need to detect the features by which to appreciate or to navigate the Dao, the way, as he understands. So that's sort of the starting point. Let me go back. That particular passage is a nice way of highlighting my questions as a scholar of the period. And my curiosity as a moral philosopher. Wow, why exactly is he saying this? And what are the implications? Imagine somebody coming along and saying, the prevailing view of the correct path to follow in life is one that not only is mistaken, but actually prevents you from following that path because it mutilates you in some way, depriving you of the capacities that you need to follow that path. So that's one text that presents these ideas. Now, when we start going through a number of early texts, we find that there's a discourse there in the early literature spanning a number of different collections of writings from that period, which present different takes on that basic view that there's something wrong with prevailing moral concepts. many of you may have heard of the Dao De Jing. Portions of the Dao De Jing present one sort of critique of those ideas. A number of different texts in the Zhuangzi collection present different sorts of critiques of those ideas. I'm going to try to focus on some selected passages that present ideas along these lines. We don't know the authors of these passages. They're not part of any kind of unified work. So we're not looking at different expressions. We're not necessarily looking at different expressions of the same view. They may be interrelated views. They're different contributions to a conversation in which this idea that there's something problematic about moral concepts was very prominent and attracted a lot of people's attention. So some of the richest expressions of these ideas occur in a series of fictional dialogues that are scattered across a number of regions of the Zhuangzi. The Zhuangzi is an ancient collection of writings. It's not a unified work. So within the different areas of this collection, we find a number of sections that present these ideas. Here's one conversation between a fictional Confucius character and a fictional Laozi character, in which Confucius goes to Laozi asking him for assistance in placing his collection of the classics in the imperial library. And Laozi says, well, tell me what's in it. And he launches into a long spiel about the details of ritual propriety and other matters. And Lao Dan cuts him off and says, it's too long-winded. Just tell me what the gist of it is. What's the crux? And Confucius says, and here's the passage I'm quoting, the crux lies in benevolence and righteousness. And Lao Dan says, okay, well, let me ask you, are benevolence and righteousness people's inherent nature? And Confucius says, yes, they are. If a gentleman is not benevolent, he's incomplete. If he's not righteous, he can't flourish. Benevolence and righteousness are indeed people's nature. What else could it be? And Lao Tzu says, okay, well, what do you call benevolence and righteousness? Confucius says, the heart within, being kindly and sympathetic while impartially practicing inclusive care for everyone. These are the characteristic features of benevolence and righteousness. And Lao Tzu responds and says, whoa, that last remark you made, that's dangerous. And he critiques the concepts that Confucius has mentioned. He says, all-inclusive care, isn't that impractical? And pursuing it impartially is just itself your own personal bias. Do you want to keep the world from losing what guides it? Well, heaven and earth are inherently constant. The sun and moon inherently shine. The stars and planets inherently align. The birds and beasts inherently flock together. The trees inherently grow upright. Just proceed by letting your virtue go forth and move along by following the way, and you've arrived. Why all this hustle and bustle to promote benevolence and righteousness as though beating a drum in search of a lost child? Whoa, you're disrupting people's nature. We can go back to that passage if we need to. But just sort of quickly summarizing, it offers at least 3 criticisms of these moral ideals of benevolence and righteousness. One of them is that there's some sort of conceptual problem with them. They're impractical, they're vague, they're biased in some way. There's probably what's going on here is, implicitly, because the text doesn't make this explicit, implicitly it's questioning whether there can be any justification for them because they're impractical and because they seem to actually be an expression of one particular person or group's values rather than something that's somehow objectively justified. And the second point is he claims that they're wasteful and ineffective. They're actually redundant and they kind of get in the way of following the Tao. And there's that lovely metaphor in the text of banging a drum in search of a lost child. Maybe the lost child is actually just playing quietly in the garden. There's no need to make all this noise looking for it. And then the third point he raises is that these moral values disrupt people's inherent nature. So there's an implicit claim there to something about us that we have inherently that's supposed to provide action guidance in some way. And there's corresponding implicit normative claim that acting according to your xing, your inherent dispositions, is somehow appropriate. Then the text also gives us a constructive alternative. So having rejected the fictional Confucius's idea of what the Tao is, it gives us an alternative. It says what we should be doing is just applying or letting our inherent virtue or virtuosity act and carry us along. And if we do that, the idea is that we're going to, spontaneously or immediately find some available way to follow in any situation in which we find ourselves. So if we step back a bit, we can say that this and other texts are rejecting this prevailing conception of the way as benevolence and righteousness, both as a justification for appropriate action. They're claiming that those values aren't a sufficient justification for acting in a certain way. They're questioning whether or not those values are correct in some way. And so far, we don't know what their grounds of correctness are going to be. And it's also rejecting them as a decision procedure. So if you're in a certain situation where you're wondering what to do, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I'll try to do what is benevolent or righteous, the text is saying, no, you shouldn't do that. Right? So they could be playing the role of immediately guiding action as a decision procedure. The text is rejecting that. They could also sort of be in the background. You could say that, okay, maybe you shouldn't guide action by them, but when we question what justifies our action, these are part of the story about justification. The text is probably also rejecting that as well. And I'm going to go back one slide. In its place, the proposal that it's offering us is, if you look 4 lines from the bottom on this one, just proceed by letting your virtue go forth and move along by following the way, and you've arrived, you've got it. So he's assuming that there is some path, some way in our situation that we'll be able to follow. And it's implying that we can follow this way just by letting the inherent capacity for agency we have within us, which they call virtue or virtuosity, just by kind of letting that go, letting that start to operate. Okay, another illustration of these views. This is another passage from the Zhuangzi. It's another in this collection of conversations between Confucius and Laozi. And here we get a related but slightly different rejection of benevolence and righteousness. So in this episode, Confucius calls on Laozi and gets into a conversation with him again and starts to talk about these moral ideals. And Laozi replies with this critique. He says, when chaff when winnowing blinds your eyes, heaven and earth in the 4 directions shift position. When mosquitoes or horseflies sting the skin the whole night, you can't get to sleep. No disorder is greater than benevolence and righteousness confusedly tormenting our minds. To keep the world from losing its simplicity, just let yourself move as the wind pushes you and take your stand in the culmination of your virtue. So there's this idea of an inherent capacity for acting appropriately. Why all this hullabaloo like someone who marches around banging a drum to search for a lost child? So this version of the story, again, repeats that metaphor of banging the drum to search for a lost child. The snow goose stays white without a daily bath. The crow stays black without a daily inking. The simplicity of black and white isn't worth debating over. The spectacle of fame and reputation isn't worth treating as an achievement. When the spring dries up, the fish live together on land, spitting moisture on each other and dampening each other with the froth. But it would be far better for them to forget each other in rivers and lakes. Okay, so to rehearse some of the key themes there, there's this implication that benevolence and righteousness are going to disrupt the normal functioning of the mind or the heart, which is the organ that guides action. There's an implication that they're unnecessary, ineffectual effort and fuss. In place of them, we're instructed to employ our inward virtue or virtuosity to find paths to take in particular situations, adapting to our context as we go. And we have this pivotal metaphor here of a community devoted to benevolence and righteousness being, analogically similar to a stranded school of fish struggling to survive by spitting froth on each other. And I'll go back to the passage. Here's the passage again. So at the end, we have this line saying, when the spring dries up, the fish live together on land. They try to keep each other alive by spitting on each other, but it would be far better for them to forget each other in rivers and lakes. So the metaphor here is one in which we can see that benevolence and righteousness are regarded as remedial attempts to recover an earlier stage in which we didn't need the sort of guidance that they offer regarding how to interact with each other. So the implication is that following them as a standard of conduct is like the fish spitting on each other to try to keep each other wet. And although apparently in the story here, although the fish can survive that way, according to the story, it would be far better for them to forget each other in rivers and lakes. So the ideal mode of interaction with others in our community, by implication, is one in which we don't follow any sort of explicit standard. We don't attempt to pin down what is morally correct, but rather we interact with each other by forgetting each other in a natural environment in which we don't need to rely on these moral crutches to guide us to act. So ideal interaction with each other for these passages is interaction in which we don't actually pay any attention to each other, yet are able to interact in some smooth, frictionless, appropriate way. So if you think of a school of fish swimming along together, when the school turns, all the fish turn together without bumping into each other. They just sort of do it by feel. They're not reflexively, self-consciously following any sort of explicit standard. The text is implying that that's how we ought to really be engaging with each other. And that in doing that, we don't need to be following these explicit standards of right and wrong. Those standards instead are analogous to, it says, chaff from winnowing that gets in your eyes so you can't see. Okay, so that's a handful of examples of the material that we find in these old texts, rejecting and critiquing the prevailing idea that benevolence and righteousness are a reliable guide to the Tao, the way. So some core themes that we find in these texts then are that reliance on benevolence and righteousness is a sign of some sort of pathology. It's a personal pathology as an individual agent. It's also a social pathology. They signal a kind of loss of or alienation from the Tao and a disruption or a crippling of our inherent capacity for following the Tao, for finding appropriate paths. The texts also often emphasize that these moral teachings interfere with our inherent nature or our inherent dispositions, our spontaneous functioning. Now, in the text at the time, the people reading and writing these texts would have implicitly drawn a connection between this concept of inherent nature and health. So there would have also been an implication then to many of them that if something interferes with your inherent nature, then it's actually making you unhealthy in some way. It's preventing you from flourishing as an individual. Another point that comes up again and again is that the guidance available from more basic sources renders these moral concepts redundant. So if you know how to attend to contextual clues that present you with a path to follow, and you know how to use your inherent virtuosity or capacity for agency, to feel out that path, then you already have a sufficient source of action guidance built into the situations in which you find yourself, and you don't need to appeal to these moral teachings. And then a fourth point is that the moral teachings, these moral values, are antithetical to this state of forgetting yourself, forgetting others, and the state of forgetting is thought of as a sign of adroit action. Now, I can say a word or two about what they mean by forgetting here. They're referring to situations where you're just not attending to something, even though you might still be interacting with it. So it's something like paying no mind to. And if we draw on other texts within the discourse, examples we get of successful forgetting would be something like All of you are wearing some sort of clothing right now that goes around your waist. And until I mentioned that, you were not paying any attention whatsoever to how your waist feels right now. Right? Having mentioned it, I've now drawn your attention to it and you're all thinking about it. Okay. Or everybody is wearing some form of footwear at the moment. Before I mentioned it, you weren't paying any attention to it whatsoever because it fits your feet properly. Another example would be, an example we find in the text is that somebody who doesn't know how to swim, who is riding in a boat, may be fearful of falling into the water. They can't possibly forget the water because of their fear. Somebody who's an excellent swimmer doesn't care about falling into the water at all. If they fall in, it's just nothing to them. They'll just hop back in the boat so they can forget the water. So one claim that the text makes is that good swimmers forget the water. Okay. So ideal conduct then involves some sort of forgetting-like state, according to these texts. And if you're trained to pay attention to the norms of benevolence and righteousness, they claim that's going to interfere with attaining this forgetting state. So since those norms really are the prevailing conception of what the Tao is, an obvious question that we might want to ask the writers of these Daoist texts is, well, okay, if benevolence and righteousness are such a terrible mistake, why does everybody else consider them the prevailing conception of appropriate conduct? And the response that we find in the text is that, well, the norms that people are fixated on may have been appropriate in some limited context in the past, but they're a misguided extrapolation of guidance that, maybe was appropriate or introduced by moral teachers for some particular purpose in some particular circumstance that no longer obtains. So that's our explanation of why these are out there in the culture. Now, why aren't they appropriate? Well, another theme that shows up is that neither benevolence and righteousness, nor even the written traditions that have been passed down to us from the sages of previous generations can offer reliable guidance to conduct, because the path that we want to follow, as they understand it, is one that involves a process of ongoing transformation. So instead of following any fixed standard whatsoever, they suggest what you want to do is learn to be a companion to the process of transformation. Another metaphor they use to explain the role of explicit norms like benevolence and righteousness is that they're like footprints. They're footprints that maybe the ancient sages made in a particular context, but we're not interested in the footprints. We're interested in how they actually walked. And we can't learn how they actually walked just by looking at their footprints. Okay, so the position they reach then is that benevolence and righteousness are not the Tao, they're not the way, and they're also not an adequate or practicable guide to the way. They represent misplaced, fruitless effort, which directs us away from simpler and more effective paths that would better suit our nature and our context. And that not merely are they a mistake, but they actually constitute an obstacle to applying our inherent capacities to find and follow the most fitting course of action. So this is where they step back again and they say, what you really want to do is just apply this inherent virtuosity you have to find a way to proceed in concrete contexts. Now, I can say a word or two to flesh out why they probably think of appropriate action that way. Pretty much all early Chinese thinkers conceive of action along the line of the performance of a skill. And the Daoists do this to an extreme degree. So they think of action primarily as a kind of skilled performance. Adroit or appropriate action would be competent or excellent performance of something that's akin to an art or a skill. So once we understand that they're thinking of action along these lines, that action is the performance of something like a skill, those the proposal that we should forget what we're doing, the proposal that we have to be able to do it by feel and we can't appeal to explicit standards. These proposals start to make a bit more sense. So if you think of a skill like riding a bicycle down a sloped road that's full of potholes, many of us can do that, but we can't really, we don't do it by following any sort of recipe for navigating our way through the potholes. We don't do it by consulting guidelines about what's appropriate to do. No guideline any more specific than simply don't fall in the holes, basically. And in many cases, we don't even really know how it is that we do it. Okay, and I picked bicycle riding as an example because many people who ride bicycles don't actually know how they ride a bicycle. If I say to you, if you want to make a right turn on your bicycle, what's the first thing you do? Most people are not aware that the first thing you do to make a right turn is lean left, right? You shift your body weight in the opposite direction, and that's what turns the bicycle. So that's a nice illustration of how the Daoists are thinking about action. And what they're doing is they're taking those features of skilled action and extrapolating them. And one of the points in their thought that we want to kind of be alert to is when they do this extrapolation, is it legitimate or not? Maybe there's a problem there, right? Maybe despite the fact that in practice we actually act on feel that way, that doesn't mean that we don't have any sort of fixed guidelines that we follow. Maybe the role of those guidelines is different from the role of feel in the practice. That's one of the questions that we might want to ask. Okay, another point they bring up is that the way, as they understand it, is continually shifting and transforming. And so you can't offer fixed criteria or norms by which to guide us in following it, because it's just not susceptible to description or delineation that way. It's not the sort of thing that you can articulate through fixed norms or values. So in my bicycle example, you might say, the actual riding of the bicycle can't be pinned down through instructions, but there are some very general ends of bicycle riding, like try to reach your destination and try to not fall down, and you can certainly make those explicit. So isn't that a pretty good counterexample to what these Daoist texts are saying? And I think their response would be, okay, well, the example doesn't get at the way itself, because the way itself is something that, unlike bike riding, has no fixed end. It's just a matter of, moving along with the path in a way that is excellent, that is ideally adapted to the path. But what's going to count as excellent or ideally adapted to the path is actually something we're going to discover as we go. We can't identify it in advance. So I think that's the sort of response they might give. Now, that might seem pretty strange, right? But again, if you think of the skill example, I think riding the bike down the hill might be a pretty good example of what some people who work with skills call open skills rather than closed skills. So a closed skill is something like I give you a fresh piece of paper and a sharp pencil and ask you to draw a circle. And if you practice that enough, you could get very good at drawing a circle. And if each time you're getting a fresh piece of letter-sized paper and a sharp pencil, then the performance of the skill is, for all intents and purposes, almost exactly the same in each instance. Open skills are things more like riding the bike down the road with the potholes. Every road's going to be different. The potholes are going to change over the season. So you can't specify in advance exactly how things are going to go. So they're taking that feature of certain sort of skill performances and suggesting, well, even though those performances have a fixed end, Dao doesn't, because Dao is sort of at a meta level, of those things. It's at a level in which even what skill we're going to perform is up for grabs. It's open to question, and it's something that can transform in different contexts. Okay, now in the source text that I'm taking these ideas from, The critique we find is directed at a specific conception of ethical guidance, articulated mainly through these concepts of benevolence and righteousness. And I want to suggest that, well, probably, if we were able to engage the writers of these texts in conversation today, I think we'd find that they would willingly extrapolate what they're saying into a critique of morality conceived of more generally. The reason I think that is that they often use those two concepts as a pair. And in Chinese, it's ren yi, and they often use them that way. They couple them together. And it's clear that although I don't think they're going to be identical to certain contemporary conceptions of what is moral or what is morally right, it's clear that they overlap pretty extensively with certain contemporary understandings of morality. They're understood to be applicable to everybody in every sort of situation. They're understood to take priority in guiding and justifying action. They're understood to express some sort of impartiality or concern for others. They're considered to be universally justified. If something is justified according to them, nothing else can defeat that justification. That's how the Ruists and the Moists will typically think of it. So I suggest then that, for the purposes of discussion, we can take the critique that's being proposed here as a critique of morality more broadly. And the significance of this critique appears to be that, the Daoists are suggesting we should just jettison the notion of morality and jettison the idea of justifying or guiding action by moral concepts on the grounds that the practice of morality, as delineated by those concepts, and the associated ideology of guiding and justifying action, the notion that those concepts help us to determine what the way is, that whole basket of ideas is detrimental to our following the way as it actually is, and to the exercise of our virtuosity. Again, our virtuosity for them is something like a capacity for agency, and that stands at the core of their conception of the good individual life. Not only the individual life, but it also stands at the core of their conception of how we relate to the cosmos and the way, the Tao as a whole. So they're saying that, okay, these moral ideas are detrimental to our following the way and to our living the best sort of life that we can live. We can extend that by saying they see them as detrimental to the idea of nurturing life, living as well as we can. And as you saw in a couple of passages, they suggest that the practice of guiding and evaluating human conduct by any conception of morality is mutilating or crippling because of how it interferes with our virtuosity or virtue. Now, you might wonder, in practice, what are they really rejecting here? Well, in practice, they're not rejecting the typical practical ends of morality, such as attaining some sort of personal well-being and being considerate of the well-being of others and avoiding selfishness and trying to interact with others in an appropriate or harmonious way. If anything, they're actually more concerned with some of those values than the advocates of benevolence and righteousness. And one byproduct of the way the Daoists think of agency and our place in following the way is that somebody who actually picks up on their ideas and attempts to practice them is likely to be very, very unselfish and very attentive to the needs of others. What they're doing is rejecting appeals to morality as a source of action guidance and as a criterion of appropriate action. In this context, you might wonder how their ideas compare to those of Nietzsche, and I think that there's some overlap here. Certainly, they're going to align with Nietzsche in rejecting morality as a cultural practice on the grounds that it has some sort of pernicious effect on our ability to live the good life, on human flourishing. They would depart from Nietzsche in holding that pernicious effect applies to everyone, not only to an exceptional handful of people. Okay, so that's the critique that I wanted to introduce. Now, here are a few, very inchoate preliminary critical reflections on it. One is that I haven't really attempted to give you a full account of the Daoist alternative to morality. I can very quickly sketch it out for you. It's intertwined with that conception they have of action as a sort of skill. So they think that in the performance of any sort of skill, you develop a feel for finding your way through the task at hand in a manner that fulfills the contextual ends that you're dealing with. And the way you do that, they describe as a mode of action that leads you to find, moves or choices that manifest good fit with your situation, or that demonstrate a kind of competence in dealing with the factors that you're managing in a particular situation. So, very crudely and roughly, that's their idea of how you're going to direct action in the absence of these moral concepts. And from the examples that they give us, you can see that they're a pretty good starting point in working out these ideas. But I think that we need a much fuller account of just how plausible those ideas might be, or in practice, how they're going to go. That means we're going to need a more detailed explanation of the way as they understand it. And I see those questions as pivotal questions for ongoing research and understanding what a Daoist ethics might be. So I think that those are, research questions that are live questions for us today. I've done a little bit of work along those lines. Another worry we might have is this. Is there any chance that we noticed a few passages in which they refer to people's inherent nature or inherent dispositions? Is there a chance here that what they're doing is they're conflating normative and descriptive issues? And might they be saying that the appropriate way to act just is whatever way we're kind of inherently programmed to act, or whatever exists naturally is thereby appropriate or right? And as soon as you start to interfere with that by coming up with some sort of moral guidance, some sort of norms for us to follow, you're disrupting what's inherently there. And if that's their view, then they seem to just be assuming that what's inherently there is somehow, justified, or at least pro tanto justified. And it might seem that they could be confusing normative and descriptive issues. And what I'd suggest is that I think that they can avoid this criticism. I think what they can say is that all this focus on spontaneous responses to situations or acting according to our inherent nature may not refer to the substantive content of what we do, but rather to processes by which we find what fits, that criterion they have of appropriate action. And that notion of what fits or what's competent is still going to allow for a distinction between normative and description. It's still going to allow for a distinction between how people actually do things right now and what might be an appropriate way of doing things, because it allows them to develop an explanation of how you might do things better or worse. And as long as they've got that better or worse distinction, then it looks like they can probably sustain a meaningful distinction between the normative and the descriptive. Okay, a further point. So they're criticizing this conception of benevolence and this conception of righteousness. And I suggested that this amounts to a critique of morality. But we might question that. Maybe that's not what it is. Maybe what they're saying is, no. There can be, some useful substantive conception of morality. It's just not that. Those concepts are not an appropriate way to give an account of what morality is, but we still have an account of moral justification. After all, you guys are still talking about this concept of the way, the path, right? So, aren't you just proposing a different, refined conception of morality rather than rejecting morality? And I think that no, actually, they really are rejecting morality. The reason I think that is that all of the candidates in the discourse that they're working in at the time for moral concepts fall within the scope of what they want to reject. That's one point. And the other point is that the sort of justification that they're working with doesn't look like moral justification anymore. It's really deeply contextual. And there are cases where it might overlap with moral justification, but it doesn't seem to be moral justification. And you can imagine them affirming actions or judgments in certain cases that you or I might think are immoral because they see that they're justified for some other reason. So they're not somehow taking something that looks at all like morality and setting that up to play the same sort of role that moral theorists think moral justification typically plays. A further worry is this. One reason that moral concepts seem very important to us is that we appeal to them in cases where they contrast with prevailing social norms or prevailing customs to try to explain what we think is wrong with the social norms or customs, right? So we can have a society in which slavery is widely practiced. Everybody thinks it's fine. Nobody objects to it. The slaves themselves ideologically have been indoctrinated to the point that they think being slaves is good as well. And you and I look at it and just think, no, this is horrible. We think that even though by the standards of the time and the customs available to those people, they consider this to be justified, we believe it is nevertheless unjustified, and we appeal to moral concepts to explain why. So if the Daoists are rejecting those concepts as a source of action, guidance, and justification, do they leave themselves with any grounds by which to justify social criticism and social reform? And I would say, yes, actually they do. It's pretty clear that they do. It's just that they don't express their criticisms of problematic conduct or practices in moral terms. Remember, I suggested that they think of action largely along the lines of skill. Well, they freely criticize actions that they disagree with. And what they do is, instead of using moral terminology, they tend to use the terminology of skills. You notice that just now I said that when they're trying to describe what is appropriate action according to the Tao, one of the words they use is, I translated as something like competent, free-flowing, successful. So they'll point to what they see as problematic content or practices and suggest that it's not free-flowing, it's not successful, or it's clumsy. And they'll actually use words such as clumsy to reject such conduct, right? And so in cases where I think you have perhaps certain social groups being oppressed, for instance, or people treating others in a way that really doesn't seem appropriate, they would probably say that this is clumsy, or this is, it fails to be skillful in the appropriate way, or it's not harmonious. They often appeal to a notion of harmony, because what they identify as the problem here is that in social relations, that sort of bad treatment is likely to have repercussions that will just continue to disrupt social relations over time. And they see that as a kind of clumsiness or a kind of failure to find the best fit with the Tao, the way. Okay, and then my last sort of critical question is, well, what exactly are they going to offer in place of morality? So I mentioned this notion of competence or flowing through. Well, how are they going to unpack that? And this is a pretty important question. Because they're very slippery in discussing this problem. And these texts are not theoretical treatises. They're a series of anecdotes and conversations and stories. And in the anecdotes and stories and so on, what they often do is appeal to skill exemplars to illustrate competent practice of the way. And you can see that there's a really obvious fundamental problem when they appeal to these skill exemplars, because every skill has got ends or values built into it. It's a skill because it's a way of doing something, right? There's an end there. And if we're talking about morality, morality is supposed to apply to all sorts of contexts or all sorts of agents universally, regardless of what the end is, right? Or if we're talking about, say, utilitarianism, what they're doing is they're proposing a certain end that's going to somehow unify moral justification. So the skill examples are helpful in understanding what the Daoists are getting at, but they're also helpful to us in pointing out that, you can't allow this appeal to skill to let them sort of cheat past this problem of explaining ultimately, what are we up to here, right? Another way of making this point is to say, what if you've got someone who's really, really skilled and by feel is very good at doing something that you and I would consider morally abhorrent? They do something terrible, right? In class for 10 or 15 years now, we've called this the Daoist Nazi problem. Because one class I taught long, long ago, and which became very prominent, Quentin Tarantino's movie *Inglourious Bastards* had just come out, right? And you'll recall that in the movie, there's this Nazi officer who's a really expert hunter of Jewish fugitives, and he hunts them down and he kills them. And we thought, okay, so he's quite masterful in his skill of responding to his environment and contextual clues and hunting down Jewish fugitives, but that's terrible, right? So can he be considered a Daoist master because he's so good at what he does, when what he does is actually a really horrible thing? How are they going to respond to that? And I think what their response is, it's going to be very, very complicated. What the response is going to be is that we always find ourselves on some path holding certain values. Those values are not absolute, but they're the values that we start with. And then through responses to the particular context in which we find ourselves, we may be drawn to revise those values. So there are no absolute values that guide action. We work with what we have in the context, but we're open to revising them as we go. And the skill examples, what I would suggest, are supposed to provide illustrations of how we would do that. So they're not illustrations of some sort of endpoint, and they don't assume that there's some sort of general endpoint. They're illustrations of how you find your way through problematic situations, perhaps modifying your values as you go. So I think this is the sort of approach that they would probably offer as a replacement for morality. Clearly, however, they or we on their behalf are going to have to do a lot of work to try to unpack and articulate that approach and then begin to examine it to see whether or not ultimately it's plausible. Okay, that concludes the prepared remarks I had for you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fraser.